Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a quick look at the Musescore Muse Sounds Brass sounds. And this is a bit of a response to a comment on a recent upload that I put out there on the channel of a orchestral symphonic piece that had some significant brass parts in it. And one of the subjective comments that was made, and I always welcome critical comments, that's fine, that's great. But one of the comments that was made on the piece was that all the sounds sounded good. They particularly liked the woodwinds. The strings, section strings sounded good. They didn't care for the solo strings at some times. But then the comment was made that the brass, none of the brass essentially sounded good. All of the brass, none of it sounded like real brass instruments. And the assertion was that this was coming from a person who plays regularly in symphonic situations. Um, and I thought that was very curious because as a brass player, I am a brass player. That is my schooling, my uh, classical schooling in instrumental music was on trumpet, and not only that, but in doing so, I played in a lot of groups, very high caliber groups. I also played in a world class drum and bugle corps for some time, quite some time ago, but for some time. And I have quite a lot of experience playing brass in a number of different settings, from very small chamber groups, quintets, to very large and robust um, drum corps situations, and a very good one at that, with high level instruction. So I have no idea where that comment was coming from. From my subjective view, it didn't really make sense. But I want to try to be a little more objective about this and talk about the Muse Sounds Brass. And some of this will touch on things I've already discussed on the channel when talking about mocking up for Muse Sounds inside of Musescore 4. I think that there is a right way to do it to get realism, the maximum realism. And then there's, I think, the strategy that most people will take, and that is to just write their music and then hear generally what it sounds like based on the Muse Sounds playback from the generic, regular four players notation. My feeling is that if you're going to mock up in Musescore 4, that you need to really monkey around with the notation. You need to treat the notation environment like a digital audio workstation, and like you treat MIDI data in that sort of environment. And it really is no different. It's not like you're doing more work inside the notation. You're doing all the same things that you would do inside of the digital audio workstation in terms of finessing and creating subtleties to the playback by picking different combinations of dynamics, hairpin dynamics, articulations, messing around with note lengths for phrasing, that sort of thing. I'm not going to talk about that specifically, but I just want to point that out, that as you look at this score, we'll look at this in a moment, you're going to see an oversaturation of articulations, strange note lengths, lots of breaks and jumps and things in there that normally would not be part of I think, clean notation for people to play. And that is because this is emulating human players as I see fit, player by player throughout the piece, to get the most realism. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And this is what I do for all of my mock-ups using Musescore 4 and Muse Sounds. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at real brass playing first and then come to this piece. Now, I want to start this by saying that I don't have an enormous amount of time in my hands. It may seem like it when you look at my channel content across my YouTube channels that I have and other media that I put out. I really don't have a lot of time in my hands. And I can't think of a bigger waste of time for me, just for me, and this isn't a knock on people that do this, but I can't think of a bigger waste of time than mocking up somebody else's music. Now, I say that because really the best way to demonstrate this would be to take some kind of brass piece and find legitimate recordings of it and then mock it up, that exact same piece, inside of some kind of environment, either a DAW or inside of Musescore 4 with Muse Sounds or whatever, and then do some kind of comparison. I don't have the time for that. I don't have the interest in that. I can't think in terms of creativity. I can't think of a bigger waste of time than mocking up somebody else's music. So I'm going to try to do the next best thing. This is a piece of music that I wrote some time ago. I pulled it out, dusted it off, and tried to sequence this for the current iteration of Muse Sounds. This is my music. So I'm going to use a piece of my music that is very similar to another piece of music that we're going to listen to. And we're going to look at a few performances from a few different groups at varying levels, just to demonstrate the subjectivity of this entire conversation. You see, you can play quite regularly in a number of groups, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the complete picture, particularly of what the highest level kind of commercial sound would be like. And I think that is what the Muse Sounds is really going for. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I think it's important to have context. Context really matters. I can say that I play often in groups, or I play in symphonic situations, or I hear symphony orchestras a lot, or I go to my nearest symphony orchestra in the nearest large town where I live, and I hear a lot of that, or I play in one or whatever, and then make my judgment based on that. But it's a whole other thing to have a wide perspective from a lot of different groups, and compare and contrast the ways in which groups can sound quite different from each other when they're essentially doing the exact same thing. So that is the premise. Let's take a look at, this is a Philip Spark piece. This is called Dance Movements. It is a wind ensemble piece. This is the third movement. It's a great piece, by the way, a great suite. This is the third movement, called Lento, and it's for just the brass, just for the brass. It's only the brass section of the wind ensemble. Now, a wind ensemble would normally be one person per part for a wind ensemble. And if you go here, a legitimate wind ensemble, that is the complement that you'll get. Now, a wind band can, of course, be a lot larger than that, and more often than not, a concert band that plays wind ensemble literature will be a little bit oversized. So we're going to see some larger groups and hear some smaller groups as we listen to this. Now, I'm not going to listen to the whole movement. The whole movement is several minutes long. I also risk a copyright strike on this. Hopefully I won't get a copyright strike. I probably will get a notification that I can't monetize it, which doesn't matter because I don't monetize this channel anyway. But I'm going to play a few excerpts here, and you can see the sources of this movement, which is just for brass, wind ensemble complement. And then we're going to look at a piece of mine, which is very, very similar, same kind of style, same kind of tessitura for the instruments, the same sort of tempo and dynamics, and same style of music. And we'll just make a comparison of the Muse Sounds to real performances of a similar piece. So this is Lento for brass. This is the first group is a Mansfield University Concert Wind Ensemble. This this university is not far from where I live in New York. This is over the border in Pennsylvania. It's a pretty good university, good music school, as far as kind of a regional school of music goes. And this is a very, very good performance of the piece. I'm just going to play a little bit of it, and then I'll talk about the performance itself and how this serves, or maybe doesn't serve, as the best example of brass playing when we're trying to adjudicate the sounds in Muse Sounds or any other sampled sound set. Okay, so this is the louder moment. That chunk right there is kind of the louder moment of the piece, which is going to be very important for Muse sounds as we look at that in a moment to have a comparison of the loud kind of music. This, I think, would be comparable to a very, very good group that most people, if you're a music aficionado and you go to hear good groups that are close by where you're at and regional kind of circumstances, this is very much like what you would hear. So they're playing at maximum volume, this fortissimo or whatever, kind of the roof through the segment, and you can hear it's a very good, well blended tone. Yeah, that's I think what a lot of people that perform with regularity, and if someone says I perform a lot in symphonic situations in an orchestra and a wind ensemble, and I know from my experience this is what things are supposed to sound like, this would be, I think, that bar for that, in my opinion. When I was in music school, this is about where we were at. This is the kind of sound that you would get, and the kind of direction, and that plays into this quite a bit. That the director will often say in these more regional kind of venues or in a typical university, school of music university situation, conductors are often after very strict balance and blend. And that often requires that the brass kind of keep it tamed down quite a bit. As we get more into the professional or the more commercial sounds, you'll see that that is not the case in those settings, but that would be here. And that can kind of jade your concept of what brass really sounds like, being in that environment. So that's the first example. Here's another one. This is another, I don't know who this is. This is a Birmingham Symphonic Winds. So this is another kind of regional, this is not a school, but more of a regional wind ensemble. And again, they're playing this movement. You can see this is a video recording of it, and this is around the same section. So let's hear what this sounds like. Okay, so again, this section is full out. This is full out, but you can hear in this kind of environment with this group and this direction that they've been given, it's pretty reserved. It's very reserved. It's very well balanced and blended and very reserved. Everything is kind of kept. The lid is kept firmly in place on the top. And again, this is very, I think, typical to what you would get if you follow around a very good nearby regional kind of group. Okay, so again, this isn't necessarily the most commercial or professional kind of sound. It's a very reserved interpretation of brass instruments. Here's another one. This is a really good group. I don't know who this is. Alos Wind Band. I don't know where this group is from. This is a little more commercial. It's a much larger group too, but you can hear just individually they're playing a lot louder. So this is more like a concert band sort of complement. You're kind of doubling or tripling, almost quadrupling the number of people that you probably would need for this piece. So this is about twice the size of the last group. beautiful playing. Okay, this is again a larger group, but you can kind of feel the lid is on it, right? They're not really playing full out, even though this is maximum volume. And remember, dynamics are relative. So maximum in one piece is the same as maximum in another piece, even though the dynamics may not be the same. Okay, so they're supposed to be playing full out here. And given the size of the group, maybe that plays into some of the direction that they're getting. But it's extremely in tune, really well balanced. This is, I think, the best performance so far of this out of the three that we've looked at. The next one is my favorite one, the one that this is my go-to performance of this piece. This is the North Texas Wind Symphony. It's recorded quite some time ago. There's a very old recording of it. Eugene Corcoran was the conductor, and you can hear the direction in this is kind of a cut above what we've listened to. This is much more commercial, much more full out. The lid is off, and the players have been given a direction to really play at the extreme limits, not the extreme limits, but the true limits of their instruments when giving it a full-bodied sound. So here's this roughly the same section. This is University of North Texas Wind Symphony. Okay, this is a cut above, right? This is much, much bigger, even though the ensemble is a little bit smaller probably than the last one. The performers have a license to really play full. And you can hear it. You get what we call cuivre. It's a brassy edge to the brass instruments that we weren't really hearing in the other iterations. And there is a taste out there among musicians, symphonic musicians, orchestral and wind musicians and conductors, to really hold the brass back and keep them down and avoid that brassy edge as if it's a poor tone quality. But it isn't, because it's actually something that the brass instruments can do. And if it's done well, it's got a flavor to it. That's why when you hear film score, studio recorded film score with symphonic orchestras, you hear that a lot more. It's very, very edgy. And you can have a brass section of just a couple of trumpets, a couple trombones, maybe a tuba, maybe 4 French horns, absolutely bury the rest of the symphony. Just a handful of people to 90 other people, they just completely bury them out because the instruments can do that. And that's something to keep in mind. So this is my favorite recording of this. I got one more to show you. This is really the top of the mountain right here. If you want to find the absolute best wind ensembles, you're going to go to the military ensembles, and not just the American military. The British military has some exceptional wind ensembles, and they very much favor brass instruments. But this is the Air Force Band, which is a very aggressive wind ensemble or wind band. If you've ever heard them, it's quite loud. It's quite a large sound that they put out. So again, the same section. This is probably the most commercial iteration of this piece of music with respect to the style of playing. Okay, so huge sound. Nobody dares tell them to put a lid on it. Okay, this is what professional players can do and should do. Right, you give the widest dynamic range that the instrument can deliver, as the music indicates. So when we're thinking about mocking up in any environment, this is what we're shooting for. Now, if you want to emulate those other that kind of other context, which you might be more familiar with hearing in a more regional, less professional environment, you can, but you're going to really have to tamp down on the dynamics that you're using inside of Musescore 4. So let's come back to this. I'm going to play the whole piece. It's not very long, but it's very much in this vein. Okay, it's a very similar kind of style. It is not that music. It's my own piece for my own purposes, but it's the best comparison I could think of to kind of demonstrate what Musescore 4 does compared to a live environment. Okay, so listen carefully, and then we'll talk about what Musescore 4 and Muse Sounds is doing well. Now, I don't know about you, but when I listen to what Musescore 4 Muse Sounds can do, if you're careful about what you're putting in there and you're intentional about it, I think it's a pretty good dead ringer for the real thing. I don't really see where that particular comment was coming from, even in the context of a different score, because I mean, I follow the same taste no matter where I'm mocking up, whether it's in here or, in a brass environment or if it's in an orchestral symphonic environment. So what does this do well? Well, it's got the samples for the commercial full out wide open sound on all the instruments. So this may not be a sound that you're used to hearing in the places where you hear music, but it shouldn't be, right? This is supposed to address the absolute widest capacity range of the very best musicians. That's what you want in a sample set. And I think that the sample set has that. Now, I think one criticism that's come up a number of times regarding the brass sounds, particularly the trumpets and trombones, is that it kind of gets to the very cap, the very top, a little quickly. Between mezzo forte and forte, it's quite a jump. It's a really big jump. It gets very brassy very quick between those two dynamics. So, if you really want to keep it tamped down, you got to avoid forte. You're going to have to write mezzo forte as your cap, and then you're going to just have to bring the mixer channels, way up, particularly for the trumpets and trombones, in order to satisfy that more blended, mellow sound. The cylindrical brass instruments like a trumpet and trombone, they're going to give a much more brassy, edgier sound than the conical instruments like the euphonium, French horn, cornet, tuba, these other instruments that have a more gradual kind of taper to them. So that's a feature. That's not something you avoid, and it's not a sound that is unlike those instruments. It's just a sound that you don't hear often if you're not always exposed to high quality commercial playing, professional playing, and high quality professional direction and conducting. Having a director or conductor that says, you know what, really open this up, play it out, play it full, play it big, balance it out, but make sure you're all the way out at the envelope, the edge of the envelope. So I think that Musescore, Muse Sounds does that very well. It's got that top end. Now, what do you have to be careful of? I think it's unnatural to sustain notes like that for very long, or to sustain phrases in that mode. So one thing you want to do in your writing for mock-up purposes is make sure that you shorten up long notes so that you can add artificial breathing where real players would breathe. And you should do this part by part by part. You don't want to add phrase breaks for the entire group unless that's required by the music. You want to make sure your phrase breaks are individual to the player on that particular part. And sometimes when you have two parts playing unison, like the horns are doing it, have two horn parts, when they're playing unison, it doesn't necessarily have to follow the same breathing and phrasing. You might want to make a separation, make a change. Put tapers, dynamic tapers, so that when you play full out on a long note, that it's tapering down to a lower dynamic. Even if they're supposed to be sustaining, you want to taper almost every single note. That is a natural thing for brass players to do, is to have some kind of dynamic taper. You have an aggressive sustained sound maybe when it's full out, but almost every note will have some kind of taper on it, unless there is a crescendo coming to an active release on that note, which I'm not doing that very much in this piece. But unless that's called for, you want to taper all the notes. Also on multiple tonguing, there's quite a bit of multiple tonguing here across all the instruments. You want to add some articulations that break up that multiple tonguing. Now, Muse Sounds in the Play engine, I've found, seem to operate on a round robin, so it grabs on different samples so you don't get machine gunning. But you can really improve this a lot more by adding separate articulations on the multiple tonguing section so that it's not exactly the same articulation, even if it's with a different sample. It's just simply not the same articulation. That's not really how it's done. When you're double tonguing or multiple tonguing, triple tonguing, You know, when you're doing that, using the da 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 da, the front edge of the tongue sound at the behind the teeth or at the lips, but you're using also the G sound, ga ga ga, or the ka sound in the back of the throat, which is going to give a slightly softer sort of sound. So when you go through multiple tonguing, you should apply, I think, to get the best results in Musescore 4 Muse sounds, you want to apply articulations that kind of accentuate that differentiation, and that gives you a little bit more realism in the playback. So again, this is for mock-up purposes. And you would do the same in a DAW. I mean, you would change the velocity layers to achieve that same kind of thing. So it's not like there's more work doing it in notation than there would be in DAW. You would have to enter all that MIDI data in the same way in that environment as you would here to get the right sounds. Now, another thing that Muse Sounds does extremely well is portamento. All instruments have some portamento. All of them do. Even wind instruments as well as string instruments. That is the changing from registers from one note to another and the integration of a sliding sound to get from one note to the next. You can hear it very, very well in this this part right here, but it's throughout. Every single part has plenty of portamento that is very natural to the instrument. But if you listen to just the trumpet here, you have portamento going up, portamento coming down, especially with the sustained tenuto marking up here. You would get that, even though the note is tongued, it's not slurred, you would get that portamento effect. And that's quite realistic. I mean, that's extremely well done. My hat's off to the Muse Sounds people and the Musescore people with this play engine and the way that it calls on samples in that way. It is really just brilliant. That's high-level realism right there. So again, I don't really know where that criticism is coming from, that subjective criticism that this does not sound good for brass instruments. I think they pretty well nailed it. I think they nailed it. I think they got it downright, absolutely right. On a lot of things here. Again, it comes down to the writing. Is your writing idiomatic for brass players or woodwinds or strings or whatever? You know, you got to know what the instruments can do and how they behave whenever you're writing. And if you're going to mock up, you need to change the notation to suit what real people would do in a real situation. To get the best results. So anyway, that's just another look at the Muse Sounds brass sounds and how they can be used for mock-up, and a direct comparison to a very, very great piece. If you have a chance, listen to all of this Philip Sparke Dance Movements suite. It's a really, really brilliant piece. One of my favorite wind ensemble pieces collections, and particularly this Lento for brass is just a beautiful work. Uses, very traditional functional harmony, but just very, very emotive music, that Philip Sparke piece. So anyway, best of luck with that. I wish you good luck, happy composing, and happy mixing.